thanks for coming and accepting our invitation.
Certainly.
Um, we really appreciate that. The three of us are supporters of free markets, and as you can
Hmm.
see, everybody's name is there. David Crespo, Christian Light, and um, Christian Light has an introduction for you.
Okay.
So
All right,
that
yeah,
being
we'll get this started. This is totally not plagiarized from from your profile. All right, Dr. P.J. Hill is a former professor. He served as the George F. Bennett Professor of Economics at Wheaton College for 25 years, retiring in 2011. He's published many books and articles in the areas of institutional economics, property rights, and natural resources. He's a senior fellow at PERC, the Property Environment Research Center. His books include The Birth of a Transfer Society, The Political Economy of the American West, Environmental Federalism, and the topic of our interview today, The Not So Wild Wild West.
very good. Um, yeah,
All right,
Dr.
who wants
Hill.
to go first?
David, you want to ask some
Who's
questions?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll go
Okay.
first. I'll start first. First of all, PJ Hill, it is a pleasure to meet you, and I enjoyed your book very much.
Good. Glad to hear that.
I want to bring us to tell me if I'm pronouncing the name of that town, Abilene, Kansas.
Yes, Abilene. Right. Hmm.
Abilene,
Hmm.
the famous cow town, as it was called. I read both the book and the article that you and Terry wrote
Right.
back in 1970.
Right. Took a
And
long time between the book and the article, or the
yeah,
article and the book.
yeah, I remember you and Tom. You told Tom that. um, there was an incident in that town. You referenced Paul Wellman's resource when you made this statement that in that town in between 1868 and 1869 there were no homicides whatsoever,
Hmm.
but the killing started to occur as soon as government law enforcement came into the town, whose express purpose was to prevent such killings. Now, I believe this question can reflect to every other town, but in this specifically, I wanted to know how the heck did it happen that as soon as the government law enforcement gets into that town, that homicides starts appearing up when their job was to prevent such killings?
I don't have a great answer for that, and it could be no causal effect. Basically, the argument was simply that you can't all that government isn't necessarily the answer to violence problems. That they're kind of, or at least top-down government, bottom up coercion. I mean, every society needs some way of coercing people. And David Friedman's book, The Machinery of Freedom, is not a non-coercion book. It's a book that talks about competing jurisdictions of coercion that keep there from being a monopoly on coercion. And so it could have been that there were several competing forces there. I must say that the one piece of data that has been most contested in the book is the whole question of violence on the frontier, because there have been other people after we published the book that have said, no, there was, that the murder rates that we're quoting, there are other ones that are much higher. So, with regard to the basic data, I would say that that may have been revised by more current historians. In terms of why, part of it depends on when you go with government, do people decide that they don't have to take as much responsibility themselves? And that could be. But we don't have a great theory for that one. We do have a theory for small level government, and this basic theory, or you can call it anarcho-capitalism, if you will. And the theory there does say that the more local the forces are that are trying to produce order, the more likely they are to represent the wishes of the people. And part of the problem, part of the thesis of the Not So Wild Wild West book is that things that evolve from the bottom up. And there is this argument that we can come back to about, have we written a book about anarchy, or have we written a book about local small scale government? And that one people have argued about for quite a while. And I'm not sure what the answer to that one is, because you could say that everything we describe in the Not So Wild Wild West is a form of government. On the other hand, you could say, well, it represents a form of local-based anarchy. I'm not sure we can find an answer to that one very easily, because it becomes kind of a semantic problem. And as I said earlier, it does take some level of coercion to enforce property rights. And sometimes it's coercion through norms, not through force. But so a local community can just have the belief that you own yourself and you kind of own the Lockean proviso of whatever you've mixed your labor with. So with regard to that particular case in Abilene, I'm not going to be able to give you a very good answer, because I've not gone back and tried to follow up anymore in terms of that issue.
Who else wants to take a turn?
You had a really good one pertaining to that movie.
Ah,
That was a good one.
all right.
Remember, it was an example of Hollywood.
Yeah. Mr. Hill, or should I call you PJ?
Whichever. PJ's fine.
PJ. Did you ever get to see the movie Open Range?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This makes it easier for me. As you recall,
now the other question will be if I can remember it well enough.
I watched it a long time ago, and I recently watched it again.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, and it brought, and in anticipation of this review, I was looking throughout the book as a correlation to what the movie was about. As you recall, the major focus of that movie was a conflict that was developing between the cattle drivers, or free grazers, as they called them in the movie, and the ranchers. And this spoke about in the past how, because cattle drivers were very much getting into the properties of the ranchers and the farmers, this was about to develop conflict. And so that was the focal point of the movie, which led out to the shootout towards the end of the movie. So now I'm very curious. What would have been a very good private sector solutions that could have been implemented to resolve the conflicts between the two parties without violence?
Well, in that case, it does seem to me that open range, the cattle drivers were running a strange sort of an argument, and they were arguing that that you ought to be able to go and graze your cows wherever they want to go. Well, that doesn't work in a world of private property. And so in some sense, they were arguing for a set of rights that they didn't have, and those rights were in conflict with the ranchers. So I ended up with not a lot of sympathy for them, because I said, okay, if you go into an area where there's private property rights and you want to use some of those sorts of rights. Now, you could go back and say, well, traditionally, maybe the whole area was open range. Our work says, though, that very early on in the open range, people did establish boundaries. They did say what you wanted to do, what you could have. And the whole idea of open range, that you're going to trail the cattle along, is not an economically viable sort of a solution. So these guys, you really need some sort of a stable home base. The idea that they could just continually move along and graze, I would say, was almost a fictional creation rather than an actual conflict. One of the solutions would be to say to them, well, there's already property rights here. You want to be a part of those property rights? You can rent them. You can go work for a person that has them. You can buy them. But in a world where you have already established property rights, and it's not clear with those ranchers if those were legal property rights or if they were a set of norms that had evolved over time. Anderson and I in the book claim that it was difficult to establish legal property rights to the range because the Homestead Acts, which were an unfortunate way of trying to establish property rights, limited property to 160 acres to start with, and then 320 acres. That was 1862. 1909, it went to 320 acres. And then I don't remember if it's 1913 or 1914, the Stock Raising Act that took it to 640 acres. Well, that didn't really work. Ranches needed to be at least probably 5,000 to 6,000 acres. So because that was the economic way of producing, ranchers went ahead and established rights, not rights that were not enforced by the federal government, but they established rights to their land. So then when the open range people come along and say, well, we think we would like some of those rights, those can lead to conflict sorts of situations. People say, I want your rights. That's conflict. The question is there a more peaceful way in terms of doing that? And I did think that the movie misrepresented, I do not know of historical events where people came in and simply claimed that they would like to ignore the rights. Now, there was some conflict between people that ran sheep and people that ran cattle. And that conflict was because the main mechanism to restrict entry was the roundup, which was held twice a year. And so that roundup, determining who could be in that roundup, was a way of controlling access. Whenever you have markets at work, you have to have some way of controlling access to the basic property. And the book basically argues that we shouldn't just think of the federal government or top-down government as doing that, but people in their own interests, because of culture, norms, they will evolve ways to do it. So that's kind of how I think about it. And so I don't know enough about the actual history of open range people. I saw that as a somewhat fictionalized account in order to create a conflict.
That's too bad. That's too bad to know.
There's more evidence of Hollywood Western.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Hollywood needs conflict. And that's one of the characterizations of, of so much of the West. It's not that exciting to write books about people peacefully solving their conflicts, and so, or to have movies. One of the interesting things that I sometimes ask in my lectures is for students to figure out how many bank robberies there were between 1860 and 1900. Now, I don't have data on all of the Western states, but I have it on some of the Western states. And then I offer to give them, when I'm giving a lecture, I take a copy of the Not So Wild Wild West, and then I tell them, whoever can come the closest, I'll give them a free copy of the book. So I ask them to write down a number on their notes of how many bank robberies they think in all of these states. And I give them the list of the states that occurred between 1860 and 1900. I think it's 1860. I'd have to go back to my notes and see if it's 1860 or 1870. And so I start at 1,000. How many over 1,000? There's always the people there because that's what Hollywood portrays. And then I say 500 to 1,000, 100 to 500. And then I get it down. And the answer is probably 6 to 8 over that 30 to 40 year period. Well, why? The reason was everybody had not necessarily sidearms, but they had a rifle or they had a shotgun either behind the door or over the door. So you can imagine a bunch of tough desperados riding into town. They stomp into the bank and they point their guns at the teller and say, give me your money. Well, very quickly word travels through the city, which may be 500 people, maybe 1,000 people, in order to be big enough to have a bank. They race out of the bank. They throw the saddlebags with all of the money in it over their horses' withers, and they start galloping out. Well, what happens? Well, they don't go 50 yards and they get shot out of the saddle. Everybody's armed, and there's a very well understood rule: you don't ride by, you don't rob banks. And so the usual thing is they're able to get out of town, and then the hapless sheriff corrals 5 or 8 people, and then after 4 or 5 hours, they gallop off after the bank robberies, and they don't get them. Well, that didn't happen very often. And it wasn't because the banks were armed. It was because the general populace said, don't rob banks. If you rob banks, we'll shoot you. Well, that was a pretty good, generally understood rule. And because most of the time the firearms were kept for shooting varmints or perhaps a steer that broke its leg, but you wouldn't be reluctant to shoot somebody that robbed the bank. So almost nobody robbed banks. So that's just a part of Hollywood. In order to make things look good, then we go to the bank robbery movies, of which there are just almost no incidents of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've
Dr. Hill,
watched.
yeah, I wanted to. Oh, did you want to say something, Christian?
I was just gonna say I watched a few of the lectures you did when you were asking that question.
Okay, yeah. So
It
you've seen the lectures, you've seen me use that.
yeah, it's funny
Not
how
in the
few
book. I
people.
discovered it afterwards, but it makes a great way to actually lead into the whole question of violence. So yeah, you
Yeah,
know all about it.
it's funny how few people actually get close to the answer.
Yeah, right. It is. Yeah.
The funniest comment when you made that question, I was telling Christian this. You said something along the lines of, there was very few bank robberies, and you asked, why could that be? You asked the classroom, and some smart aleck in the back said there weren't any banks.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that one. Yeah.
Which actually, that might be a normal sort of a thing, to think, well, this is the frontier, there's no banks. Actually, finance was pretty important on the frontier. So banks came quite early. They were one of the main institutions that would come. Probably the first thing would be a bar, then a grocery store, and then a bank. But there were banks all across the West. So, but yeah, that is a, maybe that's a reasonable answer if you don't know what the history was in terms of financial institutions. You guys are well prepared. You've read the book. You've watched some of my lectures. You can move on and ask me hard questions.
Well, all right. All right. No. Well, I wanted to congratulate you. I know that this book won an award in 2005. I forget which one. So in that sense, I'm not all that prepared. So you're a little overestimating me there, Dr. Hill. But I appreciate the compliment regardless. But yeah, I wanted to congratulate you because I thought that book serves as a tool for anybody that wants to learn economics, specifically new institutional economics. I thought you did a great job with that. There's plenty of principles that you've incorporated into your book. And I think it's fair to say it's a case study. So it satisfies the empirical teaching method. It's not simply theoretical.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
that was one of Coase's arguments that you should get out of Blackboard, what he called Blackboard economics. And economists can draw very complicated graphs trying to explain something, perhaps without going and looking at the real world. So this was an attempt to see how things worked out in reality.
Right. And another thing, it also, a slightly different angle, it also gives the argument for free markets, for less or no government, because that also is pushed forward theoretically. And I think prior to your book, there really wasn't a book not only that didn't cover the West, but that didn't really have this empirical argument for free markets or little to no government. In fact, I got 2 of those books. Well, I've had the Machinery Freedom
for some time. That book was actually important to us when we were writing the first article, because we had read it. We'd had David Friedman actually come to Montana State to lecture, and I'd gotten to know him when I was in graduate school. So that was, but there are empirical arguments in the Machinery of Freedom, aren't there?
Well, I think it's mostly theoretical, I think.
Yeah, okay.
So, and then there's this other book, Explorations in the Theory of Anarchy, and that seems to be also theoretical as well. And I think you were kind of driven to provide an empirical or a case study for this. So it's not only a tool for economics that has all sorts of concepts, rent seeking, even some with special interest groups, transaction costs, of course. So, I mean, it's an excellent book. And so, if I could give you a question with that, what books are you aware of that are comparable to your book? Some of the books that I think come to mind are the Leeson's book, The Invisible Hook, which came after yours.
Right.
There's the Scarbeck book, The Social Order of the Underworld. I have these books here next to me, so I'm looking that direction. Um, but what other what
Those
other
would be those two follow very much in the same sort of a tradition, in that they're both reality, looking at pirate ships and organization there, and looking at organization within prisons. So Bruce Benson, a retired economist from Florida State, is working on what he calls merchant law from, say, 900 to 1100. It works pretty well, and then you get the Great Plague in the 1100s. But his book, I don't think it's out yet. He has an earlier book on merchant law, but it's it's bottom-up law that deals with trying to just provide rules for people to sell their goods, oftentimes at trade fairs in Europe, say 900 to 1100 or 1150. And it's the same sort of a thing, actually looks at the circumstances, finds that there's very effective sorts of agreements, rules. You could actually have somebody ship your goods from, say, northern France to southern France, or from someplace in Spain to a trade fair in France. And but it was not because the rules were enforced by kind of large-scale sovereign governments. These rules just evolved to solve coordination problems. So I've been going to email Bruce and ask him what the status of that book is. I went to a book conference at George Mason University where we had copies of the manuscript, and we had there were like 8 or 10 of us there. The author of The Invisible Hook was one of those people there. And so Bruce had a rough draft. We gave him a lot of comments. But it's a similar sort of a thing. It's looking at the not so wild, wild west, but it's looking at it in the concept of Europe, say the year 1000 or the year 1025. The other two that you've mentioned are important. David Friedman has done some work on Iceland.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of too.
Yeah,
Medieval Iceland.
The Iceland sagas. So that would be not just another thing that I would think of. But those would be the main ones. You seem to already have looked at some of the main ones. I think David Scarbeck's work is really interesting in terms of how you get rules within a prison.
Oh, interesting. I had this question. I think I hinted out to you in an email. You mentioned your previous article or your older article, the one that has anarcho-capitalism, an experiment in anarcho-capitalism in its title. And I noticed that you were using Schelling point. The Schelling point was really important to your piece. But then when you wrote your book, it expanded the economic concepts significantly. So I wanted to know, when did you come about the new institutional economics? I'm after you wrote your first piece. And I also want to get into that. I think it's fascinating that you were studying at the University of Chicago while Ronald Coase was teaching at the law department. And somehow you weren't able, you weren't aware that he was there, but he's such an important figure in your intellectual development. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine how you did not know he was there, but that was prior, to the internet era. So I
Right.
think that's kind of neat. If you can tell us when you found this school of thought and maybe
Well,
some
yeah.
of the things related to that.
So I left Chicago in 68, got married that summer, had my PhD pretty well done. My PhD was not really on institutions at all. It was on immigration into the United States, 1840 through 1920, trying to assess the impact and how quickly that people adjusted to coming to the country. Then I went back to our cattle ranch in Montana. That's one of the things that makes me different from many of the other professors is that I've tried to do two careers. One of them is to raise cows and ride horses, and the other one is to teach. Then I went to Purdue University for a semester. Then I came up here to Montana State for a quarter. Each of these were in the fall. Then I went to the University of Iowa for one semester. I would always go back to our cattle ranch to work to run the ranch, which is what I planned to do when I finished my PhD. When I was finishing my PhD, even though the degree was not bestowed upon me until 1970, I really had everything pretty well done by the summer of 68. It just took a while to get the final drafts through. A professor, Greg Lewis, a very well-known labor economist, interviewed me or had me come in and say, well, I've lined up interviews for you at various universities, Brown, Purdue, other places. And I told him, well, Professor Lewis, I'm not interviewing anywhere. I'm going back to our cattle ranch, which he said, oh, no, we've invested a lot of money in you. And so, every year on my fellowship application, there was a spot that said professional plans. And I always wrote cattle rancher. And I said, well, I didn't think I was deceiving anybody. And he said, well, a lot of people come into Chicago with a lot of strange ideas, but they change them. So I changed mine. It just took me 25 years to do it. So after I had done the 3 years of visiting terms, then I came to Montana State, probably, I don't know, 73, 74. I'd have to go back and look at my Vita to try to figure that out. And Terry Anderson came at the same time as a young assistant professor from University of Washington. And he had studied under Doug North. Steve Chung was there. Harold Demsetz was influencing all of us. And Terry did a seminar on property rights that first year that I was a professor at Montana State. And at that point, I was teaching 6 months. I'd gone from teaching 3 months out of the year to teaching 6 months. So I was going to spend 6 months a year at Montana State, which I did for, I think, 13 or 14 years. And then I went to Wheaton College and committed to 9 months out of the year. And so Terry presented this work in probably 73 or 74 on property rights. And that was really my introduction to kind of new institutional economics. So I have no regrets about my Chicago education. It was great. I learned a lot of economics, but I really didn't learn much about institutions. And so that was just not a part of it. So the idea of Ronald Coast, nobody was opposed to it, but I just was only a part of, I just didn't think about it. And I think I told you that Ben Klein, who was one of my friends and a classmate, he actually snuck over across the Midway at the University of Chicago and sat in these classes by Ronald Coase, which was very good. And then Ben went on to a career at UCLA, wrote articles with Armin Alchian, another person in property rights. So it really wasn't until the early 70s that I became aware of new institutional economics. Terry and I became very good friends and spent a lot of time together thinking about these sorts of issues. And so it's kind of out of that. And his association with Doug North, Stephen Chung at the University of Washington, kind of put together with my Chicago education, and we started writing about it. So I would say my graduate school career didn't really open my eyes much to the whole idea of the importance of institutions. And there was a reason for that. They were just assuming, most of the Chicago education said, let's assume we have fairly well-defined and enforced property rights. And then let's see how can we analyze prices? How can we think about issues of monopoly? Are there monopolies? Are there not? How competitive are the markets? Those were very useful sorts of questions. But just the assumption that we know that we're talking about this level of institutions that are already there. Well, an interesting question is, how did they get there? And who thought of them? How did they put them in place? And so that was really kind of my continuing education after graduate school that opened me to the whole idea of Ronald Coase, Harold Demsetz, Doug North, Stephen Chung, Yoram Barzell. He was at Washington also. So those are it took a while for me to learn and then to start applying those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, that helps explain. That was my theory that you came up about those ideas after. That you're definitely influenced by Demsetz and North.
And I would say I always was interested in kind of, you might call, free markets. I grew up in a society or in a home where it was probably a kind of a quasi-conservative libertarian home. My mother subscribed to this little thing called FEE from the Foundation for Economic Education, and I read that. I read publications like the National Review. I read some Leonard Read, and then I knew of Milton Friedman before I went to the University of Chicago. And Friedman's a great thinker, so he influenced me quite a bit. But he has some of the basic theory that could lead to institutions, but that wasn't really a great part of his analysis. So I was sympathetic to markets. I learned a lot more about markets at Chicago, and then I learned a lot more about institutions working with Terry Anderson.
I had a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
I was curious because it seems like your career is very much a lot of your work has been done with Terry Anderson,
right?
And so I was going to ask you how you guys met, but I think you more or less told
Actually, I went to the University of Washington before I came to Montana State to give a seminar, and Terry was a last year graduate student there, and I went to lunch with about 10 or 11 of him and some other graduate students and a couple of professors, and he remembers that, but I don't. So then we both came to Montana State. He turned down a job at the University of Michigan, which was in some ways ranked higher than coming to Montana State. But he decided to take the Montana State job, and it wasn't because we knew each other. It was just that we really kind of met. There was a real harmony in the sense of we had similar sorts of views, and we worked well together. Every Friday afternoon, I would stop by his office on my way home, and we'd spend a couple of hours just talking about issues. And so, Luis, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at my Vita, but a lot of my stuff is just kind of early articles on theories of property rights. And that's those were more technical, if you will. I published several in the Journal of Law and Economics, but they were with Terry. And sometimes when you work with somebody else, it's very much separate sorts of work. One guy writes one part, another person writes another part. Ours was very much a joint work. I mean, we would talk for a while. So that's an interesting idea. Which one's going to start writing? So one of us would start writing, and then the other one would critique that. So it was a great friendship. We did a lot together. We have not co-authored much together in the last few years. A month ago, he said, I think we got one more article we ought to do. And so he's laying out some groundwork in terms of how we might think about, he's working on Native American kind of bottom-up sorts of rules. That's not something I've worked on as much. That's been mostly his work. So we'll see if we end up doing anything together or not.
Well, with that, I did notice that he wrote slightly more, I think, than you when it came to, or at least it was noticeably that he wrote more than you when it came to the Indians. And
right.
Like
he's gone on since the Not So Wild Wild West. He's gone on to do a tremendous amount of work on that, and he's got several books out. Here's one, Unlocking the Wealth of Indian Nations. That's one of his books. And then he's got others. So he's gone on to be a very productive scholar in that area. he's applying some of the same theories that we've talked about, but he just continues to work on that. He has an appointment at the Hoover Institution now. So remember, we're old guys. We're getting to the end of it. Terry turned 75 last summer. I turned 80 in October. So it's not clear. Maybe you're reading what we've done, and there won't be anything else. This is at this stage.
I hope that's not the case.
Well, it is the case that after a while, I'm just fortunate to be alive, and so I'm not. I'm not promising any more books. So several people have asked me, "Do I have any more? Am I going to write another book?" And I'm not sure I will. I've written a few more articles, but book's a pretty big effort, especially the one. Even though the Not So Wild Wild West is a small book, we did a huge amount of work. You'll notice lots of references. So I would read and read sometimes
Oh yeah.
for several days, and then I would feel like I could write 2 paragraphs, and then I'd go back and read again. So it was a long process. So you may
Dr.
be
Hill,
talking to a guy really at the end of his career.
I wanted to know, obviously you guys are similar in many ways so far as your ideas are concerned, but surely there's some differences between the two of you. So I wanted to know what are his strengths and what are your strengths? Or another way to phrase it is, what are his intellectual contributions or his perspective and yours?
Boy, that's a
Differently.
hard one. I'm not sure we have dramatic sorts of differences. One of the things that we found we found articles that we would read and, like a Stephen Chung article and say, oh yeah, this is what that, Terry may be more mathematical, more analytical than I am. I'm not sure how much of that. He's probably a better writer. I mean, he writes a huge amount. For most of his career, he gets up at 5 or 5:30 in the morning and writes for a couple of hours before anything else happens. And that's one of the reasons he can turn out stuff. I think he's got, maybe 40 books that he's been involved with, 40 or 50. I've been involved with, 15 or so, 10 to 15. So that part of it's the difference in productivity. So he's done the work that he and I have done together, but then he's done his own work too, or work with other people. He's been very good at mentoring young people. And so he's had several authors, Nicholas Parker that's written with him, Brian Leonard that has written with him. So he's done a great job of bringing on kind of the next generation of scholars. I'm probably not as good at that. I probably work alone more. So Terry has been my main co-author at Wheaton College. I worked with a guy named Steve Bretson, a law professor. He and I wrote a couple of articles together. But unlike Terry, I don't have a lot of co-authors. So we have very similar ideas about how you approach problems in terms of thinking about institutions, kind of getting down to the very bottom level of where they came from. One difference is I'm a Christian believer. He's not. That hasn't kept us from working together. But it's been a great time of being together. When I went to Wheaton, that did lessen the time that we were just spending time together. And when we were at Montana State, then that kind of facilitated things because every week we would try to have 2 or 3 hours of just thinking about economics and standing by the blackboard in his office and drawing some graphs and thinking about issues and then going forward with that.
One thing, I wanted to ask you, PJ Hill, when I read your article and I later on read your book, there was one incident that I was legitimately confused about because it's the subject matter of the miners and in their camps.
Right.
How you talked about they came up with their own private courts, private arbitration centers, their own rules, and the whole which we call it and the way they defined and enforced their private property rights.
Mhm.
So with that understanding, I could fully understand their antagonism or their resistance against government bureaucrats or government agents who want to try to get in and impose their coercive authority upon the miners. To which the miners will say, "No, we can take care of ourselves here. We
Right.
don't need you.
Mhm.
We don't need you here." What a, what I'm confused about are professionally trained lawyers, because they even had a, as you wrote in your article, they even had a law where anyone who was caught practicing law in their districts would face 20 to 50 lashes and be
Yeah.
kicked out of the district. So I'm here asking, what the hell did the lawyers do that earned hostility of the miners?
Yeah. I think they probably were trying to apply outside law. They were saying, um, but the government says, or, back in Illinois, in Galena, Illinois, in the lead mines, these are the rules that apply. And I'm not sure, but they clearly wanted to devise the rules that they thought were the best from the bottom up. And that is one of the points of the book, is that top-down rules are oftentimes imposed on situations that are different than when those rules were devised. And so the miners were very much thinking, we can do the rules ourselves. So I don't really know the answer to your question, David. I don't know. I don't know what they did. I just found that in one of the descriptive volumes and decided that it was worth putting in. But my guess was it was the attempt to try to apply outside rules. And they were saying, hey, we don't need outside rules. We'll come up with the rules ourselves.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions. The first one doesn't really have anything to do with the book, but I was curious. You were at Wheaton College for so long. Did you happen to
Mhm.
know philosophy professor Arthur Holmes?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, did you ever interact with him or get to talk to him
Yeah.
or anything?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have a degree in
How do you
philosophy.
know
So,
him?
I have a degree in philosophy,
Okay.
and I've been watching his history of philosophy
Oh
lectures.
my, those are pretty old. You can tell that was done when they were very first doing video cameras.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's really cool.
Where's your degree from, Christian?
University of Texas, Arlington.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. I don't think he would. I'm not sure that he was particularly inclined towards free markets.
really.
Um, other philosophers that I think that are David Schmidt at the University of Arizona. Um, see,
Nozick.
Tibor Machan is another one. He's passed away. Eric Mack, another one that think that markets, that would be much more favorably inclined towards markets. You can, if you may already know those, but they are philosophers that then work out kind of some of the ways about how markets would work. Of course, Robert Nozick would be one of the first ones that kind of comes to mind in that sort of an area. What about your philosophy professors at Texas? Any of them that were market inclined, or did they ever get down to that level?
It probably didn't come up much. There were a couple in office hours I talked to that definitely weren't hostile towards
Mhm.
free markets, but probably not as free market oriented as we
Right.
are.
Yeah.
But there was definitely a couple I could tell they weren't big fans of the market
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
or guns. I've heard a couple comments they had about guns. So
Yeah.
the other question I had was I've noticed this interesting thing. I call it liberty lives on the frontier, and it seems like throughout human history, the areas that are the frontier or that are farther away from government control, it seems like that liberty really seems to develop there or be an important aspect of those. I was curious if you had any comments on that, and maybe also the aspects of when they go into Mars or the moon or something like that. If
Yeah.
maybe liberty could live there.
Yeah. Maybe it can. I think one of the things that happened in the West was there were Now, again, I find some of the actions of the Euro Americans with regard to the Native Americans as violating their rights. So it's not to say that everything was hunky dory in the West. I think we referenced the Anderson and McChesney article, Raid or Trade. I'm looking in the book here. So they do a nice job of telling you that. Let's see if it's in here or not. Yes. Journal of Law and Economics, 1994. They argue that it was the presence of the federal government on the frontier that actually led to some of the depredations against the Indians. And that was because there was a government they could appeal to get them on their side. And they were big enough and powerful enough, the Army was, that then led to more takings from the Native Americans. It's really interesting. If you look at that article, you'll discover that most of what we think of as the major tragedies with regard to Native Americans is west of the Mississippi. There is an exception, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, when they had Andrew Jackson forced the Cherokees to leave their home ground area. But many of the battles that we think of as, atrocious, and they were, came when the federal government came in with their army and the settlers said, aha, we now have enough force behind us. We can go ahead and carry out our takings. So that's just an important point to think about. And I don't have perfect assurance that in the future, as we move into areas that will solve these sorts of problems, I do think the pirate ship, Pete Leeson's, The Invisible Hook is an interesting one. So we do have some case studies of where people have figured out ways to try to solve problems. Do remember that violence is expensive, and people are always looking for ways to try to reduce violence. The question is, do they reduce violence in a way that recognizes the rights of the people that are there? And sometimes that's not the case. Historically, that has not been the case in lots of situations. So I don't think you can take our book, The Not So Wild Wild West, and simply say, oh no, we could have had that amount of freedom everywhere if only they would have done something different. There's a whole history there. One of the things that the settlers on the West generally recognized was the dignity and the worth of other settlers. You expected their rights or respected their rights, and that was important. And so societies where that doesn't happen, then you don't get a system of freedom.
You actually brought up part of what I was going to ask too, which was you mentioned that they have respect for other settlers. Do you think that the European historical and cultural background had a lot to do with how the West ended up getting settled, especially among the white people, I guess?
Yes, I do. Yeah, they brought with them a knowledge. Remember, if we go back to what's called the Industrial Revolution, or the period where rapid economic growth starts, it starts in England and the Netherlands around 1750 to 1820. And so that background informed at least some of the settlers and the Western European background of societies that were moving more towards kind of equal rights. I've written a paper for the Journal of Institutional Economics on the Jewish and Christian concept of the importance of people made in the image of God being a universal sort of a concept. And you'll find that many of what we call the Enlightenment philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, they basically, even though they had very different ideas about how you'd form government, and Hobbes, of course, as you undoubtedly know from your philosophy, Christian, is that Hobbes was all for a pretty powerful state because violence was such a big problem. But several authors have said, yes, but he still had some concept of universal human equality. And that certainly did not apply to the Native Americans. But among other settlers, there was a general recognition of universal equality. I bring some of that just from my background of growing up on the ranch and my grandfather coming to Montana in 1892 and then starting our ranch in 1894. But there was generally a recognition of human equality. And it was not a caste society, not a society in which you could claim privilege. Each person kind of recognized their own worth. One of the interesting things on the frontier that my mother said was very impolite to ask for a person's full name. You'd ask them what their name was. If they said their name was Joey, that's all you ask for, because they were entering into this kind of a social contract as a person, and you didn't need to know what, if they'd been involved in some bar fights back in Pennsylvania or something like that. But there was a general acceptance that people were equal. Now, again, Native Americans accepted, and that's a historical tragedy.
I had a question when it came to writing your book, and I think especially, I guess both your book and your article, you were influenced by your students, right? So when you were writing your book, you kind of spoke to them about some of your ideas and bounced some of your ideas off of them. I was wondering if there was any theme that kept coming up when you were speaking to them. Obviously, they don't have the academic background than somebody like Anderson, your co-author, did.
Mm-hmm.
They were younger, and most of them were coming from different places than Anderson. So you had that. But what else did you notice from their?
Well, I noticed a general interest in how do you form cooperative organizations, and how do you figure out how to focus? One of my great experiences was that Terry Anderson and I taught an economic history class together for probably 15 or 18 years. And that was a great experience, because sometimes when people joint teach, they'll say, well, why don't you take the first 6 weeks and then I'll take the next 6 weeks. We went at it with the idea we were both going to be in the classroom every day. One person would start lecturing and the other person could interrupt whenever they wanted to. And so sometimes Terry would start, and 10 minutes in, I'd say, hey, no, I think that this is another way of looking at that. So I would take over the podium and he would sit leaning against the board or standing against the podium while I lectured. And then he'd say, well, no, but here's another thing you ought to think about. And then he would lecture. So it was just this great experience. And I do remember that appealing to the students' sense of innate justice, human equality, was important. One time we were getting ready to hand back a midterm exam, and Terry said, let's try an experiment. We've given weights on each question. Let's go in, and I'm going to claim that we've decided to alter the weights after they wrote the exam. And so he did a pretty good job, kept a pretty straight face, saying, I know each of those questions was worth 20 points, but I really think that first question is worth 40 points, and one of those other questions are only worth 10 points. And that's how we graded it. And you ought to see the students, outrage, Hey, look, there were agreed upon rules. You can't change the rules. And Terry said, well, yes, we can. We're the professors. We make the rules. And so what? If you don't like it. But, and so I wished afterwards I would have actually fomented a revolt if I would have stood up and said, Anderson, you're sticking it to those students. Anybody who wants to come with me, come with me. We're leaving the room. And I'll bet you some of them would have followed me. But then finally, Terry said, okay, you're right. Rules count and expectations count. And stable expectations are a good sort of a thing. But so there were some of those sorts of things. I don't remember very many specifics from the students. I do remember them being very attracted to the idea of kind of bottom-up rules, because you use that. You use that when you're shooting hoops with your friends. You have some rules about what counts and what doesn't count. What can you get away with? What can't you get away with? And so overall, it was an experience in trying that. We also taught some standard economic history. We were economic historians, and so Doug North asked us if we wanted to write, come on as co-authors in his book, Growth and Welfare in the American Past. And we used that in class. So it was, part of it was kind of the not so wild, wild west stuff, but part of it was just standard economic history, in which we tried to explain how economic historians thought about Industrial Revolution, settlement of America, voyages of discovery, all of those sorts of things. I've come to work more the last 10 or 15 years on the great takeoff in economic growth in 1800 or 1780 to 1820, whatever you want to call the period. I would teach a lot more of that now. I didn't have that stuff in mind when I taught in the 1990s. My last economic history classes at Wheaton, 2010, 11, for class, we generally had 15 to 20 people class size. There were 43 seats in the class. And when the students discovered that that was the end of my career, I got quite a few students. So they said, well, how many of you will take? And I said, I'll take as many as there are seats. So I signed up the 43 students who wanted to take it. And at that point, my ideas evolve over time, and I taught things differently than Anderson and I did 20 years before. But I would hope that happens with professors, that you think and you change.
Right. Well, I had a question regarding the book.
Okay.
So when it comes to the actual book, what are you most proud of? Or what are some of the things you're most proud of?
Well, good question. I don't know that I've ever thought about that one. I will tell you an interesting history of the book. We wrote the manuscript.
Are you avoiding the question, Dr. Hill? I said, are you avoiding the question?
I'm not avoiding the question. I'll try it because I need some time to think about it while I talk. I guess I'll tell you one of the things I'm proud about the book is that we did make it available for general readers. And that was one of the questions was when our first manuscript had more theory and Oxford University Press said they would publish it, but they would have published it as what they call an academic book, and it would have been priced at $110 or $120. An editor at Stanford University Press read the manuscript and said, I think that if you would write those first two chapters in a less technical way, you could publish this as what we call a trade book. And maybe you could even add some pictures. So those don't go in standard economic treatises. So he convinced us that would be worthwhile, and it has had much more impact. I mean, how many of you would have bought a book for $120, that was much more technically oriented? Not that you might not have been able to understand it, but that was just a great piece of advice. And so the book has continued to go on and to be sold and to be used in classroom courses. That wouldn't have happened if we would have published a book it would have been still a book on the West, would have had a lot of the same evidence. First two chapters would have had a lot more theory in them. So I would say that's one of the things that I'm proud of, is that we got it into a form that, and I've been happy with the reception. Every once in a while, somebody, I get a note from somebody, or it comes up in a discussion that they've read the book. So the general acceptance of it has been much greater than oftentimes happens when you write a book. Anderson and I wrote a book early on called The Birth of a Transfer Society, and it's about the U.S. Constitution and how it has been interpreted over the last 50 or 100 years to allow much more rent seeking. And I was happy with that book. I thought it was a good book. It didn't have, you will almost never see it cited today. And I get my royalty statements, and maybe I sell 2 to 3 copies a year at the most. But that book took quite a bit of time, too. I had to learn constitutional history in order to write that one. So there's just a difference in terms of audience and acceptance. So I would say that. I like the fact that we do provide documented evidence. We don't, if we're going to make some statements about what happened in mining camps, we're going to go to the mining camp historians and try to figure out what went on there. We're going to do the wagon trains. We'll go actually read the history by as many people as we can find on wagon trains. So that fact that we think we have pretty good evidence for our arguments in this case, interesting case that you're asking, several of you are asking about, is that generalizable? Well, that becomes more, it's harder to say that, well, we could apply this to every situation, but we felt we could defend it with regard to the West, and and generally I would say it has been.
That was a terrific answer.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I
I think
agree.
that was a great idea y'all had of publishing as a trade instead of an
Yeah,
academic.
and that was really the advice of an editor, that he thought it would have enough attractiveness to people. Part of it's because the West is kind of a sexy sort of a thing to write about, and so. But we appreciated running into him and him giving that advice. It's considered prestigious to publish with a well-known academic press like Cambridge University Press or Oxford University Press. But oftentimes those books might sell 500 copies, maybe 800 copies. They'll go in libraries and a few people's collection, but they don't go much farther than that. They may still have some influence.
Interesting. So yeah, I had another question, and Christian and I wanted to know the answer to one of these questions. I'll start with the first one that Christian and I were curious about. What would your response be to Stefan Kinsella? Because in your book at the end, you explained that you kind of portrayed IP, intellectual property, as a good thing, as something that would create more prosperity if it existed than it otherwise wouldn't. I don't know if you're familiar with Kinsella and his work, but he's an IP lawyer, and he says it's like a creation of the state, and there's other ways of making money, and that's basically it. I mean, he gets into it more philosophical than that.
Yeah. I have not read his work. I'm somewhat familiar with the argument that we don't need to protect those sorts of ideas, that people will capture them anyway. I don't have. I do think the property rights rules to ideas in the U.S. have been extended too far, too much. And so I don't know if we need to go back to zero or not, but we do need to go back to a much shorter period. It's kind of called the Disney rule, that Disney got the rights to Mickey Mouse, I don't know, for 70 years or something like that, when originally they would have only had them for like 13 or 17 years. So I would at least move back in that direction, because that has created monopolies. I think that's just an interesting area. Among libertarians. Is that a property right that you need to try to enforce or not? I'm open to that sort of an option. I haven't really given it enough thought, and I've not read Stefan's work enough to really give you, what I would call an intelligent response there. So, sorry, that's not one that I can give you much on.
That's okay.
Okay, I'll just there's two more on this. So, how about your response to Lysander Spooner? He won't get this response from you, but he talks about the Constitution, and he says the Constitution either permits what's happening now, or I guess endorses it.
Powerless to stop it, or
powerless to stop it, or promotes it. So I know that you were somewhat big on the Constitution in some way.
Right,
So
and
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and who are you thinking about as the author there? I'm not sure if I know him.
Lysander Spooner, he wrote the Constitution.
Oh yeah, a long time ago. Right. I thought you were talking about a current author. Yeah. No, I still like the idea at the large scale level of some sort of a written document that sets out some basic rules. So yeah, I'm a pro Constitution person. I'm not sure that our ideas on the West, I still think that they worked, but could you have started the U.S. without some sort of at least coming together? And again, that's a messy sort of an idea. When do people consent to a society? Do we need unanimous consent? Those are really troubling sorts of issues. How do you establish a society, and how do you establish the rules? I do like the U.S. case, which has been violated greatly, is the idea of a central government that doesn't do much, and then lots of smaller units that do a lot more. So the idea of federalism in the U.S. case creates a lot of, if you will, competing governments. And that's one of the sorts of things that I think works better. Why did the mining camps adopt pretty good rules? Well, if they really messed up, there was a mining camp over about 5 miles that was going to do a lot better than you were. And so if you had a huge amount of violence and spent all your time fighting, if you didn't figure out a way to solve claim issues, you weren't going to be very productive. So the competition among governments is a good idea. Is the U.S. the right sort of a mix? I don't know. I really liked what we started with much more than what we have now, when many of the states have kind of ceded their rights to the federal government. And I don't see any reason for the federal government to be setting most of the rules with regard to COVID. I think that should be most a state responsibility. Here's one proposal I have that's I've probably stole from somebody else, but I would say at the federal government level, you need a 70% majority in order to enact legislation.
You stole it if you believe in property, intellectual property. If you don't, then you didn't steal it.
That's right. Some of those ideas I steal willingly because I'm not sure where I take them from. But you could have different decision rules. You could have at the federal level, boy, if we can't get 70 to 80% of the people to agree, of representatives, formally elected, to agree, then the government can't do anything. At the state level, maybe it takes a 60% majority. At the local community, the traditional 50% plus one. They can put in parks, they can tax their people for schools, they can do all those sorts of things. But that's just a statement that local is better. And that's one of the lessons that I would take from the not so wild, wild west. Bottom up, local is better.
Yeah, I'll agree. And I think it's also encouraging, you mentioned federalism, that we've seen kind of a resurgence of federalism since COVID started too.
Right.
With states fighting back against federal government.
And there has been, and that's a good sort of a thing. And so I like that. That's in some cases, the states almost formed cartels to create keep there from being competition among the states, and said, let's all go to the federal government and do the things there. And that meant that you lost some of that state by state competition. But Christian, you've been in, are you in Texas now, Christian, or where are you now?
Yes, sir. I live in Texas.
Okay. Well, Texas is running a race with California. They're winning.
Yeah. They're all moving here. That's
a healthy sort of a situation. If people in California want to go with a particular set of rules, then another state says, well, we're still under the still basics framework in which you can move from one area to the other. It's not that difficult. You don't have to get a passport. We speak the same language. We still have the same national rules on a lot of areas, but we're going to run an experiment here, and we're going to have a different set of rules than California does. Now, let's see what happens. Well, quite a few people in California have said, we think we'd rather live in Texas. So they're moving to Texas. So I think that's a much better situation than a more powerful nation state in which you have regions, but the regions can't say much, can't do much. So we still have a fair amount of federalism. We have enough that Texas can write its rules differently than what California does. And that's very healthy.
I had one more question from that card. And this one is strictly on economics. And actually, maybe before I ask you this, we are so deep in the conversation, and I never asked you, are you an Austrian? Are you a neoclassical economist?
Good question. I would say I am not a full-blooded Austrian. I'm a fellow traveler.
Okay.
I'm a new institutional economist would probably be my best description, or an institutional economist, or a property rights theory person. So I found many of the insights of the Austrians to be particularly helpful, especially role of information, the role of the entrepreneur, the whole question of disequilibrium. We're not in equilibrium a lot of the times, and what we need to analyze is the movement towards equilibrium. So as far as I'm concerned, a lot of those ideas have been, really integrated into the economics that I think is important. Depends on what we mean by Austrians. Some Austrians don't think we get much out of empirical work. Now, in a sense, I agree that some of our more involved mathematical formulation of trying to run a model for everything hasn't been that fruitful. But I still like empirical work, and it depends on kind of which part of Austrian economics that you're talking about. There have been some that have written about, kind of more of a praxeology. Things should be derived from first principles. I like first principles, but I also I'm more inclined to look at empirical work. So I don't really call myself an Austrian. A lot of my friends are Austrians. I'm not sure what else I would have to agree to be an Austrian. So anyway, I don't know if that clarifies it or not, but I'm not really sure where I am. I have found Israel Kirzner, for instance, on entrepreneurship to be very insightful. And if you think that Hayek is an Austrian, some debate about that, Hayek has been very influential on my life. I've read less. I'd say I've been less influenced by von Mises. For some reason, I've never, cracked with, I don't object to his ideas, but I've just never been influenced as much by him as I have by people like Hayek and Kirzner.
Okay, so that sets up my question.
Okay.
So Thomas DiLorenzo responded to the theory of asymmetric information. He used that as a reason why there was ongoing or frequent warring between the Indians and American Europeans. You said that it was an asymmetric information, which is a market failure. Just to be sure, do you think that is a market failure? And I'm going to give you a concise argument by Thomas DiLorenzo. He says the notion that so-called asymmetric information is a source of market failure is deeply flawed. Asymmetric information is essential, a synonym for the division of knowledge and labor in society, which is the whole basis for trade and exchange and the success of markets. So my question is, I don't know if you can digest that all. I read it.
Okay, well, I'll give you an answer. I don't know if it deals directly with his argument or not. I know Tom. I don't know that I've read this particular argument. I would say that many of the market failure arguments are talking about what Harold Demsetz called the nirvana fallacy, that out there somewhere there's a better world. And we don't know where it is, but we can say, well, these institutions failed because of some problem, the monopoly problem, the asymmetric information problem. So what you have to do is to say, well, there's some barriers there that keep the markets from working. It's not clear that it's market failure. It just may be that we live in this imperfect world. So I'm very sympathetic to Tom's argument that the argument from asymmetric information to market failure, if you go back to kind of some of the traditional economic arguments, they identify the areas in which markets fail. So one of them would be public goods. Another would be asymmetric information. Another one would be monopoly. But it doesn't mean that they have failed. The whole area, that's why I find Coase very helpful. He talks in terms of what are the transaction costs. And if we can say that there's barriers, if there's transaction costs that stand in the way of us as humans getting along, well, is there a way to lower transaction costs? Well, pretty well defined and enforced property rights, lower transaction costs. How costly is it to define and enforce those rights? Well, it's not too costly to get to a certain level. You get beyond that, and it gets very costly. And so we have kind of what you might call a desirable level of property rights enforcement. And given the transaction costs, maybe we don't want to have more. Uh, my wife and I are going to a neighbor's house tonight. Uh, Actually, he's a pastor from our church, and we're watching the musical Hamilton. My wife and I have seen it. Most other people have seen it. Um, when we get out of our car tonight, and there's probably going to be several cars there, and we want to walk to our pastor's house to have dinner and then watch the movie, I can cut across a neighbor's lawn. I'm violating their property rights. Well, they can call the police. They have said, it is not worth putting up a 10-foot high fence on our front lawn to keep PJ Hill from walking across it when he wants to get to Jeff Hamling's house. Transaction costs are such that I'm not going to worry about that one. Now, if PJ Hill rolls out his sleeping bag or is building a fire in my front yard, yeah, I'm going to get concerned about that. And I'm probably going to go out and say, what are you doing there? And if he's going to be obnoxious, maybe I'll even call the sheriff. So a lot of these claims about property rights problems are looking at if in the perfect world, or the other assumption is that if we assign it to government, then there's zero transaction costs. I think there's very, very large transaction costs in government. They face lots of information problems. They face incentive problems. So I would agree with Tom that just saying asymmetric information as a market failure doesn't take you very far. You need to say, well, what are the alternatives? Are there ways that we can generate more information? I regard freedom of the press as a way of lowering the transaction costs of information. My computer just tells me I'm having a low battery, so I'm plugging it in here. And now you're going to get a little different look at my background here because I got to turn my computer. There's in a lot of those sorts of areas, a whole idea and the belief in the rights of people to form property for property that previously wasn't owned, but that they mixed their labor with. Well, you can say that's a lower transaction cost way of establishing rights. You could also say maybe it's a natural right, and Christian can weigh in terms of whether he thinks there are natural rights or not.
We shouldn't go down that rabbit hole. Yeah.
So the transaction cost world does tell me that there are some things that you can use the word government or you can use the word coercion. See, I would say one thing that's interesting about the not so wild, wild west. You can read it two ways. You can read it as a case for anarcho-capitalism, and that's how we first phrased it in that Journal of Libertarian Studies. And then enough people, as we presented our ideas over time, said, well, we think that's government. And so we said, we're not going to describe it either way. We're just going to say these are activities, and they're bottom-up activities. And you can call them government. You can call them anarchy. David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom does say you need to define and enforce rules. His point was it's possible to conceive of very low-level competing police forces, courts. Now, that's an interesting sort of an argument. We don't have a lot of cases of that. But I find Machinery of Freedom to be very interesting in terms of what sorts of things could you get rid of in terms of top-down government. So Anderson and I kind of moved away from saying we've got this strong case for anarcho-capitalism to saying we've got a case for bottom-up generation of rules that govern human cooperation. And you can take that as anarcho-capitalism, or you can take that as low-level government.
That I had difficulty when I was reading your book when it came to that, distinguishing between private government or private governance and government or the state. So some people write the state with a capital S to imply that there's initial coercion or the euphemism of taxation, and that kind of threw me off a little bit.
Well, I would say the lines are blurry. For instance, let's say that you get a person decides to develop a gated community, and they have their own police force within that gated community. And if you move into that gated community, you accept their police force by virtue of moving in. They tell you what the rules are. They say, okay, this is what we're David Friedman advocates, and we're setting up anarcho-capitalism, except we do have our own little local police force, and we have our own court system. And in a sense, that's what's been tried to do with these little platforms where you guys may have followed that more than I have in terms of some of the libertarians that want to set up their own communities by setting up a platform in which people could live and have rules. Okay, so that sounds like, well, it kind of sounds like anarchy, but with some chosen rules by the people moving in. But I moved to Wheaton, Illinois when I was going to teach at Wheaton College. I knew what the rules are in Wheaton. They had a police force. They had a local court system. So was I moving into a state, out of a state? Was I, in which case, if I moved out of a gated community with its own police force that I'd agreed upon, that I lived in before I went there? And you could say that the ranch that I lived on in eastern Montana didn't have much in the way of formal rules. We almost never called on the sheriff. Now, if there were property rights, we did record our deeds with the county. The county had a recorder of deeds, and we recorded our deeds there. So there was a state in a sense. We relied very much on local customs for enforcement. So then I moved to Wheaton, Illinois, and I move into that situation. Have I moved into a state, or have I moved into just a low-level government? So I don't find those rules to be entirely clear. So, Luis, when you say you're kind of confused about that, I'd say I'm 80 years old and I'm still confused.
Yeah, it sounds like you're espousing the social contract theory.
Well, the whole question of how do you form a social contract? And that's a troubling one. Are you a part of the contract by virtue of not leaving when you're in a society? That you haven't left? Is that enough to mean that you've acceded to the social contract? Is there some other sort of a mechanism? And I can see Christian nodding there because he's had to think about that sort of an issue before. And, was the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which was written by a bunch of kind of white elites, if you will, and then went to the states for ratification, is that enough to make for a social contract? What sorts of decision rules do you use? So once you get into those areas, again, I don't have completely clear and definitive sorts of answers. I just say, that the more competition we have among regimes, and that's why I like federalism, the closer you come to what seems to be a social contract. So I'm much happier with what the Texans think they have with regard to a social contract than I am with the Canadian form, where the provinces just don't have nearly as much power. And so it's a relative sort of a thing, but I'm not saying the Texans have fully figured out when they've signed the Texas social contract either. So, but whenever possible, I want to go with bottom-up localized government. And I'm even willing to undergo what some people would think of as some substantial costs. I would be much happier if the Endangered Species Act were promulgated at the state level rather than the federal level. Now, some people really care in other states, really care about grizzly bears in Montana. So if Montana was the only place that dealt with its own grizzly bears with its own rules, some people would be left out. I'm confident enough that the state of Montana will preserve enough grizzly bears with their rules, killing some of them, having no-kill areas, those sorts of things, that I would be willing to go with endangered species being defined and enforced by the states rather than the national government. They're still not moving to a completely, bottom up sort of a thing, but I want to move in that direction generally when I think about rules.
Yeah, interesting. One might say, then the question of homesteading, or whose property it is, and so if they came over here, you can have that argument. I
Yeah,
guess
the origins of property rights are very, very
yeah.
difficult to figure out. They're not quite as difficult in the U.S., but you go back to Europe, and somebody will say it's mine because my forefathers took it in 1750. Somebody else will say no, but 300 years before that, you took it from my people, and so the infinite regress that you go through trying to go back to the original formulation of property rights is just one that where there are obvious sorts of takings that have happened within the last generation or so, the recent sorts of ones. The car that was stolen 3 weeks ago, the land that was taken 50 years ago. Yeah, we can try to deal with that one. I actually think reparations for slavery is not an insignificant argument. I mean, because the rights of blacks were taken and they were forced to be slaves. How far can you go back and rectify that? Who pays for it? Those are very hard sorts of questions, and I don't have great answers for how you go about doing that. So sometimes just recognizing that there have been past injustices, say that we're going to try to rectify the most immediate ones, and then say, but the most important thing is the kind of the property right to yourself and yourself to take actions and go forward from that. I just last night finished reading a book called The Last Green Valley. I don't read a lot of fiction, but this one happens to be interesting. It's about the Martell family. I know Bill Martell here in town. His family grew up in the Ukraine. At the end of World War II, they actually drove a wagon with horses clear across the Ukraine, finally got into Germany. Then finally, eventually, one part of them ended up in the Soviet part of Germany, one part of the family, the other part ended up in the free part. One of the things you keep thinking about, well, if just the right to your humanity was expressed, if you just had the right to yourself, that's such a basic one. And both the Nazis and the Soviet regime were violating both of those in just untoward sorts of ways. So I want to start with that, and then I want to try to express property rights to physical things beyond that. And I recognize that the past, anytime you push back in the past, you're always going to find injustices. I mean, I don't think you can push back with any physical property, something that's been made, thank you for my microphone here. As I look at that, that's new property. But I look at this land outside of the Perk office here, and I want to go back and say, can we make this all right to know whether we've really got the property rights to this land or not? Well, part of the problem with the Native American case is if you go back to the property that was owned by the Native Americans in 1840, they clearly weren't the ones that owned it in 1700. Once the horse and the gun came along, then the things that we think of as the Sioux, the Cherokee, the Blackfeet, they became the dominant tribes, and they took the land away from the people that were there before them. Right. So do you want to go back to 1820? You want to go back to 1750? Do you want to go back to 1600? So at some point you need a statute of limitations, and I don't even know exactly what that is, but I'm going to worry about, presently what the federal government's trying to take away from me more than I am going to be trying to worry about what happened 200 years ago.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be more difficult to find out, who's what tribe
it is
land belong to, because they don't have the same documentation, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It is very difficult, and it's very hard to solve, to rectify those past claims, because throughout history there have been predators that have ruled societies, and so predators of some sort have been kind of the standard way of ruling tribes, societies, these sorts of things. So the question is, which predators do you want to say did it wrong? And so I think those are interesting questions, but I'm going to leave some of those to the philosophers.
That means you, Christian.
Yeah,
Ah,
no pressure.
No
Hey,
pressure.
Dr. Hill, might be my last two questions here. Do you think that in the future that it would be possible to change people's perceptions about the West? About it wasn't as wild as we think it is?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's this whole question of our academics like me just providing entertainment for some of the rest of you that think that, thinking about the West is uh, as good or not, that the perceptions are correct. I mean, I have to believe that my work makes some difference. Otherwise, it's futile. So, yeah, I get up every morning and think about ideas, and I taught for a long period of time. I'm still somewhat involved with a set of ideas. And if I didn't think that minds can be persuaded by evidence and arguments, I wouldn't be doing it. I mean, if I thought that this didn't make any difference at all. Will we change the idea about the West? Oh, there's still going to be a lot of movies made, and a lot of people think about it. So, so I'm just one of Terry Anderson and I are just a couple people trying to do what we think we'll do, and we put it out there. We've changed some minds. I don't know how many. I don't have a great count for it.
Well, you changed three here.
Yeah, changed three. Oh, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, you guys were probably you were there. I mean, you might have changed your ideas about the West, but I don't think it changed your ideas about liberty, did it? I mean,
No.
And so then I'm going to ask you, why are you free market people? Why are you libertarians?
David?
Assuming that you are. David?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Why are you where you are?
Do you recognize who's on his cap, by the way? Dr. Hill?
I don't think he can see it.
I can
I
see
never-
it. Taxation is
We
theft.
don't know who that is, I don't think. But
Yeah.
how about the cap?
Oh, I can't see the cap. Oh, is that Hayek or is that Friedman? I don't even know who that von Mises?
Yeah, no, that's Rothbard.
Murray
It's
Rothbard.
Murray. Okay. Yeah, that is the taxation is theft argument. Okay.
To briefly explain it, through through a long life of experience and observations, and it was actually it's fun. Excuse me. I would have to explain culture being a major influence in helping me to lead to libertarianism, because academics, I have a suspicious feeling, eventually downstreams into culture,
Yeah.
and there are some individuals within the culture who preach the gospel of liberty, as I would like to call it, and I eventually found them within the culture, and I started reading up on the ideas. I examined the non-aggression principle, seeing how you can apply it consistently in all aspects of life, and it led to a bigger picture. And then I saw, and just like I believe Christian Light alluded to it, and I'm also a believer in the natural rights theory that Murray Rothbard preached about in his book. And so while my story is, while I have a much larger story, culture played a huge role in helping me to find liberty.
Okay. Christian, what about you? How did you come to where you are?
I would say even since I was really young that I've always had a respect for liberty. I think, growing up in the South and Texas and growing up in a conservative family, we always had a lot of love for the country and the Constitution and things like that. So the biggest change happened for me was when I joined the military, and I kind of over time figured out that the federal government wasn't exactly abiding by their end of the
Yeah.
deal in the Constitution.
Well,
So that's pretty much how I got here where I am. But
mhm.
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure exactly. I think some people are just more inclined to love
Yeah, that's
liberty.
that's what I've wondered. Are we just people that happen to place a heavier weight on liberty, on freedom? Um, I don't know. Luis, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I think I've
Well,
had it since as early as I can remember. It's funny. I have a younger sister, and we just always came up with rules, and uh, the property rights thing just came naturally
mhm,
to us. And I mean, it's also you can make several cases for it. The utilitarian case, which is I think the one that Friedman likes to make.
mhm,
Um, there's a natural law, and but I think also Hoppe, the notorious Hermann Hoppe, has a
mhm,
pretty sound, I think, intellectual argument, and basically that is you use your body to express that you have property rights.
mhm,
There's no other way of doing it, and that's indication that you own yourself.
mhm,
So I believe in the Lockean proviso as well. But my intellectual journey, because I think I always had these ideas, but when I started comprehending them on a deeper level, was with the advent of the Ron Paul campaign as a
okay.
Republican,
Mhm.
and then I just dug deeper, and here I am.
Yeah.
Dr. Block likes to call libertarians mutants, so I guess I'm a mutant.
Well,
Bring me
yeah.
to you.
I must say, there is an inherent attractiveness to the ideas if you can get people. Now, some people are just won't listen, and there's
Sure.
some others that are partially influenced. Uh, it is a neat package. Once you start understanding it, I mean, it is a pretty coherent set of beliefs. And there's, some disagreements about utilitarianism or natural rights, those sorts of things. I find rural utilitarians to be pretty close to natural rights people.
Yeah,
I don't
I
find that
agree with
with
that too.
act utilitarians. But it's fascinating. Why some people end up there and some people don't. So you guys are just really an interesting case study. And I can't tell you particularly for myself, except I just, when I was probably in high school, I started reading some of those ideas and I thought, well, I guess that kind of makes sense. And then I just pursued them. And I did have, when I was at the University of Chicago, kind of a lunch group, was a whole group of uh, quasi libertarians. I lived with a couple of guys that were libertarians. One of them just died recently, David Lindsay, and he put together just a whole list of books that we thought were important, some of the books that you guys think are important. And so just it did make sense. Now, the question of can we devise a no government world is a much more difficult one. And that's something of, libertarians versus classical liberals, small government, no government, those sorts of things. Um, One of the things I do think is we could certainly dismantle huge amounts of what we now try to do, because I just think it does impede a lot on people's freedom, and people would be a lot better off without it. So,
If I could add, PJ, um, following up with the conversation on does the book has helped influence others? For me personally, it's given me a sense of optimism
good.
because for the simple reason because I do envision in the future that we will have a free civil society, and then
Mhm.
Capistan, as people call it in the
Okay.
internet,
Mhm.
and the examples that you and Terry provided in this work, including the book itself, you you talked about the importance of institutional entrepreneurs within the book and how they
Mhm.
play a very major role in creating a set of institutions that defined and enforced the property rights
Yeah.
that everybody agreed upon. And so that gives me the sense of optimism, whether we're going to have to find a new frontier or we succeed from from the federal government
Right.
and more decentralized units, that institutional entrepreneurs will play a pivotal role
Right.
in informing the free and civil society that we can live in and enjoy in, and which and so this get not only does it give me a sense of optimism, it also provides a good blueprint on what kind of priorities we need to
Mhm.
set our sights on if we wish to create a free civil society.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it made you more optimistic.
Uh, if I could add something, Dr. Hill, one of the things that this book really enlightened me on, and I was telling these guys about it, was I was always confused as to why was it that the Indians were able to, I guess, fend off, if you will, the white population when they were warring for such a
Mhm.
long period of time. My understanding was that the whites had firearms and the Indians had, you know, bows
Bows
and
and arrows.
arrows. That was
Right.
inferior. But when I read your book, you made so much sense of that. And that was something. So, if I could summarize it really quickly, basically at the beginning, the whites had certain firearms and they were more accurate, but you had to get off your horse to fire them, for example.
Mhm.
And these Indians were on their horses firing away. And I think they could. I mean, there were so then after the whites would shoot their firearms, they would have to load it, and it would take a while. And I overlooked that,
Right.
but the Indians
And
kept
the
on.
Indians could shoot could shoot several arrows in the
Right.
period of time that somebody could. You're right. And the Indians did a pretty good job for a period of time.
And then they
And the
started
other thing was,
trading,
yeah,
and then they had the
they
firearm
understood the
trade.
terrain. They were much more in tune with how to use terrain and conditions in terms of fighting. And so, yeah, it is an interesting historical period.
Yeah. Well, thank
Well,
you. Oh, you had
Dr.
something else
Hill.
to say?
Oh, I had one more question.
Okay.
Is there any plans for you and Dr. Anderson to make a second edition of the book?
No,
No.
no, no. We moved on to other stuff. Uh, a book like this, we're fortunate that it's still around and people read it, and I get invited. Like, last April, I spoke at Hillsdale College in Michigan. A student group got in touch with me, said, "We want you to talk, give a lecture." And I said, "What do you want to lecture on?" I said, "Well, we read the Not So Wild Wild West book," and that might have been one of the ones that you guys looked at on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
And so I said, "Sure." I put together some pictures of fish traps and hunting bison and those sorts of things, and I gave the lecture. So no, in some sense, Anderson's work has concentrated enough on Native Americans. I don't think he's going to come back and do a more general book. And I don't know, at 80, I'm not sure that one should be planning on long-term projects. And so if I get another article or two out, I will be, you know, things that I'm working on and thinking about. That's enough. I don't think there'll be much more. Now, I'm already agreed that it's being passed on to you guys. You're the next generation.
Well, we're
We
gonna
will
try
try
our
our best.
Yeah.
It's funny,
Okay.
Doctor. When I asked you about a question regarding Thomas D. Lorenzo, you said that you were going to watch the Hamilton's the movie, the Hamilton. He happened to have he wrote a book called Hamilton's Curse. I thought that was
Oh,
funny. Yeah.
I don't know that. And what is the curse? Large-scale government?
Yeah.
I would imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Increased
that's, as
centralization.
I think about it, that's my answer, is that Hamilton was very good for the United States in the short run because they were able to pay off their debts. they were able to establish trade between the states. And if each state would have been kind of a sovereign entity, gains from trade wouldn't have been as great. But in his battles, he kind of won the primacy for the federal government. And as a result, a couple hundred years later, then the federal government has won too many battles. And so I'll have to go back and look at Tom's book, but I'm not familiar with that. But that would be somewhat my take on history, that the ideas for scale were pretty effective, but they didn't really think about what happens, what limits the federal government and its power over time. And it's grown too big. It's done too much.
Great. Well, I'm finished on my end. I know you got to get to watch that movie.
Yeah.
You guys?
Well, thank you for your guys' time. Now, this is not a light thing for you either, so I appreciate your willingness to sit with me for a couple of hours, and I enjoyed it.
Well, we really appreciate
honor.
you coming, sir.
It was a pleasure talking with you, sir.
Very good. Thank you. And I hope the sound came through. think I'm using my new microphone. I can't even tell for sure, but I think I am. So
Yep.
thank you.
It sounds
Okay,
good.
guys.
Take
Good to
care.
see you.
You have a good
Bye-bye.
evening, sir.
Thank you.